So just before we get into the message today, I just need to let our church family know a few things that we've had to cancel or postpone, and then a little bit about next Sunday as well. Our Tanzania trip that we've been working toward and already done a little bit of fundraising for, we've had to cancel that trip for this year. Hopefully it will go ahead in the future, and that's just something that's had to fall by the way with planning and everything else. Also, the young ladies' tea that's planned for May the 30th, we've canceled, and soccer camp this summer as well. Also, our growth groups are meeting by video conferencing of some kind, whether it's Zoom or something else. And we're doing these not because we're afraid of what's happening. We just need to be wise. We want to take care of each other. We want to just make sure that we do show that love and care for each other. One thing that we're still holding on to and hopeful for is that we will do VBS. It's planned for the end of August, so we are hopeful that we'll be able to do that, and we're working toward that end. Also, next Sunday is the first Sunday of April, and the first Sunday of the month we share in communion. So we're going to ask you to prepare. I went out and we bought some grape juice here. We're going to ask you to prepare at home, grab some juice, some bread, and we're going to be sharing in communion next week together, because we know we don't have to be in one room in order to worship together and share in communion as well. So just plan for that. And be ready for that next Sunday as well. I'm not a huge Survivor fan. I don't watch the program actually, but this week I did watch the last 15 minutes of it as I was going through the channel and just saw, what's happening in it, just to keep up a little bit. And I caught the last 15 minutes about the tribal council, and they were sharing about how this program is all about who to trust from the very beginning, and then how do you build that trust, and yet knowing that in this game, they're going to be lied to, they're going to be deceived. It's all about being conniving in order to win, and that's what they call reality TV. So I started to think about that a little bit. This genre that we call reality TV is about building trust and then using it for your own benefit. That line, deceiving, conniving, is doing anything that you can do in order to get what you want in the end. And I'm thinking, is that really reality? I know it's a genre of TV, and it's not something that we're saying this is the way all of life is, but when we call it reality TV, do we kind of I start to wonder, so is that what we think reality is? Build trust so that you can use it for your own benefit. I know that's stretching it a little bit, but I think that we need to think about that. And that's kind of where we are today. We're carrying on in our series in John chapter 18. The passage that we're looking at today is really a clear demonstration of Jesus living the truth of who He is, even through the very worst days of His earthly life. And that, to me, if He's living the truth to the very end of who He is, that tells me that we can trust Him. And in John chapter 18, there's 4 people or groups of people that we're going to learn from today. And that first group is the soldiers. The soldiers. And when we're talking about the soldiers, there's a wide range of the number that people think are involved in this. It can be anywhere from 60 to 600 is what they're saying, but it's just a large crowd. That's what many of the Gospels say. It's a large crowd. It was sent by the chief priests, by the teachers of the law, the elders. It's called a Roman detachment. Jewish officials were a part of it. It probably included the temple guards as well. But the reality is, it doesn't matter who or how many. When you think about, say it was 60, you've got 60 against 11 plus Jesus. So we got 12 against even the minimal number of 60, and those aren't the kind of odds that you want to go to war with. It's really a demonstration to me of how much they wanted Jesus. They wanted to grab him and keep him, and how much they really wanted to make sure that he didn't get away. They didn't know what he was going to do. So many times in the past when people had been there and were going to stone him, it says that he slipped away from the crowds. He had done that in the past, and so I think they might have been afraid that that would happen again. So they brought all these soldiers, this miniature army to make sure that Jesus didn't slip away. And Jesus is standing in front of those who are armed, and they wanted to show who, and he used this time to show who he really is. So there's a passage that's going to come up on the screen, John chapter 18, verses 4 to 6. It says this: Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked him, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and they fell to the ground. Just think of this scene a minute. There's over 60 soldiers that came to arrest Jesus. He's standing right in front of them. He self-identifies. He says, "I am he." And as soon as they heard that, it says they drew back and they fell to the ground. I think the first thing that we learn about who Jesus is right here is his power. He says, "I am he." And when I hear those words, I go back to those 7 statements, the 7 I am statements that John talks about earlier in his book. Those things: I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the door. I am the resurrection and life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the vine. All of those statements are wrapped up into this one thing: I am he. I am he. I think that the Jews would have understood this. Those who are in that crowd would understand as soon as he says, "I am," it's something that they know God says about himself. It's a statement of divinity. I can see why they fell away. The Roman soldiers, I'm not sure what was going on with them, but I think in some ways they're so used to people not self-identifying, they got to find the person in the crowd, that they were somewhat shocked that this guy didn't flee. He didn't run away. He actually just kind of was ready to let them do what they came to do. Because Jesus didn't turn and run, and that's so part of our human way of doing things. We watch some movies, and all movies, it seems, at least the ones that I watch, have police chases in them. Someone comes to the door, the police come to the door, knock on the door, and the guy tries to run out the back, or they're in the car and the lights go on and the guy steps on the accelerator, not the brake, and pulling over. Running away is something that we naturally do. People tend to run rather than say, "Here I am, take me." Even me, when I was in the 7th grade, the school I was at, we had a split lunch. And so that meant that part of the building we weren't supposed to go into. And for whatever reason, my friends and I decided that one day we'd go into that part of the building. And once you know it, a teacher comes walking down the hall. What do? I run away. I ran away. I didn't want to get caught. And I have a lasting reminder of that. One of the windows that I was running by, it had opened from the bottom, was popped up, and I tried to lift my arm to get over the window, and I gouged my arm. I got stitches, and I have a scar that reminds me of that all the time. I don't tell you that story because I'm condoning my choice. I'm not condoning my choices, but I ran away because I was doing something wrong. Jesus did nothing wrong. He didn't need to run away. He was able to stand. He was without guilt. I was guilty. He knew that his time had come. And he had power, but he said, I don't want to use or abuse that power. That's not what Jesus ever did. He had the power to deal with the soldiers. I mean, they fell over. He could have just walked right past them, or he could have called his angels down and taken care of these 60 soldiers. It meant nothing really, but he didn't use his power because of a bigger picture. So we see that Jesus had power that he chose not to use, but there's also the next action, I think, just tells me so much about his heart. In John chapter 18, verse 10, it says, And Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? And here I see that Jesus protects these soldiers. From a human perspective, he protected the enemy. Peter courageously took out his sword, and not being a soldier, probably not really good with a sword. He was a fisherman. He took out the sword and he took a swing at this soldier, and he missed his head and got his ear. This is Peter who earlier said he would never disown Jesus. And we're going to look at Peter in just a little bit, but right at this place, he stood up to the soldiers. He's basically said, I will take on the 60. And Jesus steps in and he says, Peter, put your sword away. There's a much bigger picture happening here that Peter didn't quite understand yet. And Jesus says, stop, put your sword away. Then he heals the ear of the soldier. Even when Jesus knows that he's going to the cross in just a few hours, he loves his enemy. It shows who Jesus is. It's just really a little picture of what is to come. He loves so much that he physically healed the enemy. He loves so much that spiritually he made a way to heal our broken relationship with the Father. While we were enemies, while we were sinners, Romans 5:8, God demonstrates his own love for us. In this, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I'm so glad Jesus healed the soldier, because to me it's proof of his love for those who are against him, and we were all against him at some time in our lives. It also means that he'll help us with our struggles, that he's there to help us with the things that are going inside of us, the fears that we have, the anxiety, and so much more. You see, the way Jesus deals with the soldiers, he demonstrates both his power and his protection in our lives. And he holds out his hands and they arrest him, and what do? They take him to Annas, our second person of interest this morning. John 18, it says this, Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. We need to stop here just a minute. Who is Annas, that they took Jesus to him? Who is he? It just says that he's the father-in-law of the present high priest. At this point in his life, Annas had no official power. He was a previous high priest, the past high priest, and he was in office from 6 AD to 15 AD. But right now, he had no official power. But Annas had all the power. While he was in office, he built a really strong political machine. He was the guy behind the scenes who would pull the strings to make things happen. Under him, it was Annas who actually allowed the money changers and animal sellers to go into the temple to make money. He was a businessman, actually, who happened to be a priest. Annas had a bone to pick with Jesus. It was Jesus who through his business, his way of making extra money along the way, Jesus kicked out those money changers and those animal sellers, and Annas was not happy that his business was extinct. So Annas had a bone to pick, and notice also that Caiaphas was his son-in-law. It was Caiaphas who said it's better for one man to die than a whole bunch of people. From my understanding of Annas, I wouldn't be surprised at all if he planted that idea in Caiaphas' head. So the soldiers actually brought Jesus to the power broker of the religious leaders. A power broker who had no problem bending the rules for his own benefit to get what he wanted. In the Jewish trials that Jesus went through, a lot of rules got bent. I'm not going to go into all of them because that's not what this is about. This is really about saying, let's see Jesus for who he shows himself to be, and that's what we want to do. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Jesus was slapped for doing nothing. But how did Jesus respond? He didn't respond in anger. He didn't slap back. He didn't stand there and prove that guy was wrong and he was right. But neither did Jesus back down. He continued to say what was right, but Jesus says it with humility, without anger, without cruelty, without getting back at the person who slapped him. He basically turned the other cheek, and turning the other cheek is the ability to still love an enemy. And so Jesus shows once again his love. And when Annas was done with Jesus, he sent him to the real high priest for a trial in the real Jewish court. It probably was before the Sanhedrin. A court of 73 men, and they had the power to deal with capital issues, capital crimes. They didn't have the power to execute that we're going to see in a little bit, but they could decide whether someone was guilty or innocent. It's interesting that as we look into the various trials and you read through all the Gospels and get a feel for what was going on here, that actually Jesus looks more and more innocent, and those who are trying him and accusing him looked more and more guilty. This was a trial that proved the innocence of the accused and the guilt of the accusers. It was unfair in every way. Just one example of that comes from Mark chapter 14. It says the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. You see, Jesus, in their mind, Jesus was guilty in this trial without proof. It was unfair in every way, but here's the good news. God took an unfair trial held by unrighteous people and used them to do his perfect will. To do his perfect will. The unfair sent Jesus to the cross. Fair doesn't matter to God. What I mean is that he can take the unfair, the unjust, the whatever, and all those things and turn it into something beautiful and something good. We all know or eventually come to know that life isn't fair. We know life isn't fair. The concept of fair really, I think, comes from our human nature of comparing. Of comparing what we want. As a kid, it wasn't fair that my brothers got the window seats in the car and I got shoved in the middle when I wanted the window seat. It wasn't fair that my older brothers got to stay up later than I did. It wasn't fair that they breathed my air. It just wasn't fair. But it wasn't fair, but comparison often makes us feel like we're treated unfairly. But here's the truth to hold on to. Just because someone doesn't treat you fairly doesn't keep God from treating you with righteousness. Life may not be fair, but God always is. See, the religious leaders were trying to protect themselves. They wanted to keep the status quo, to protect their comfort, to hold on to their power. But be careful that you don't hold that against them, because we can find ourselves protecting over the same things in our lives as well. We struggle with some of the same things. Even right now, I'm feeling it a little bit as each day goes by, and the whole physical distancing and staying as much as possible and all of that. It's starting to, every day it's like, oh, I want to have the choice. It's not really that I would do a lot different, but I just want to have the choice. And so I start feeling it a little bit more. I want my comfort, actually. That's what it boils down to. And we see pictures of people who want their comfort more than this idea of protecting each other. See, we struggle with that. Comfort's important to us as human beings. God's going to treat us fairly. Even when we may not do everything right, here's the truth that God in His great love will be fair and gives us only what is helpful from His perspective, not from our comparison perspective. Even when we slap His face, He turns in humility and love, not in anger and not in revenge. So in the midst of the trials that are going on, Peter is hanging around. In the garden, Peter defended Jesus. He stepped up. It was a courageous action in front of all those soldiers. He stood up. He alone stood up for Jesus. He was willing to take those soldiers on, and then just a few hours later, it changed. 3 times it says that he denied knowing Jesus. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. And he replied, I am not. Later on it says, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. Another says, didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, the rooster began to crow. I think there are a couple of things that changed in this courageous man's heart that changed his outlook. The first thing is that doubt sets in. He moved from the front of the crowd in the garden right there next to Jesus to just being part of the crowd, warming themselves by the fire. He faded into the background. He now was uncertain. He watched the soldiers arrest Jesus, and he let them. Peter wasn't sure what was happening. He was uncertain. And uncertainty gives room for doubt. And doubt causes us to be tossed to and fro, back and forth. What was happening didn't match what Peter's expectations were, what he envisioned. The plan wasn't working out. And so when Jesus was arrested, Peter started to doubt. Then another thing came, and that fear shows up. Fear is real in life. I think I see fear in Peter. Not that I blame him. I know that I'd probably be more like this Peter than the Peter that was in the garden defending Jesus. Peter knew what it was like to be with Jesus. He knew the confidence that he had, that he felt when Jesus was with him. And now suddenly he's separated. Jesus is over there and he's over here, and they're not together anymore. And doubt comes with uncertainty, and fear sets in with the unknown. How is this trial going to go? What's going on? I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen in the end. Already it's feeling different than he's already feeling. And so there's this unknown thing that's happening at the end, and that unknown creates fear within us. When our youngest son, Chad, decided to go to Trinity Western University, with all the things going on in his life physically, I said to him, if you want us to come and support you, I'll resign my position here at the church and we'll move so that we can support you. And some other physical things came to the forefront in his life, and he said, Dad, I'd like you to move. Dad, I'd like you to move. And I knew it was the right thing to do, but it was great and it was easy actually when it was an idea, but now it was reality. I resigned, and now I'm looking for a job. I have a deadline. He's going to start school. I don't have a place to go. I don't have a job. I don't know what I'm going to do. The money's going to run out eventually if I don't get work. And God actually is not obligated to give me a job, let alone a job that I would like to do. Doing the right thing can also be a place of fear. Now, in our case, God did open a ministry for us, but it doesn't always work that way. There are times when I even asked, I did get a job and worked in a church, but sometimes I asked myself, did I take the position because I needed something to do? I needed a job, because there were some times in that place that I really struggled with. There were some big struggles for me. I look through the Bible, I see a lot of biblical characters that had to deal with doubt and fear. There's Noah and Abraham, David and Jeremiah, who wrote Lamentation, and so many others. It just reminds me that doubt and fear are all part of being human. It calls within me, and I'm hopeful that within you, to realize the need for God's presence, because when Jesus was present with Peter, he had courage. Presence in every circumstance and situation. Presence when it doesn't feel good and the fear just seems to rise, and we get to turn to Jesus, and there's hope at times like that. Peter is actually a demonstration of the power of Jesus' presence in our lives. And so, in the midst of all the stuff you're going through, whether it's COVID-19, and there's a whole bunch of other things, that's not the only thing going on in our lives. Let's keep turning to Jesus' presence. And then through all of Peter's denials, Jesus is brought to the fourth person that we want to look at. That's Pilate. Pilate asks a bunch of questions, but he was asking them, I think, as I read through and look at it, it feels more like he's asking these questions so that he doesn't have to make a decision. He didn't want an uprising of the Jews because of Jesus, so his desire was to just kind of say, hey, this isn't my issue to deal with, this is a Jewish issue to deal with. But the religious leaders, they had already decided that Jesus needed to die. He needed to be executed, and they didn't have the power to do that. They needed Pilate to get involved. So the first question that Pilate asks is, are you the king? He looks at Jesus and says, are you the king? No one told Pilate anything, at least in Scripture doesn't say that, and yet he knew what to ask. Are you the king of the Jews? And when he says that, it's like, no, it's a Jews' problem, not me. Don't bring him into our system. Keep him out of our system. The second question actually shows a prejudice. He says, am I a Jew? Am I a Jew? The Roman governors never did like the Jews. They struggled with keeping the peace because the Jews wanted independence. They didn't want to be under Roman rule. There was no love-hate relationship between a Jew and Roman. It was a hate-hate relationship. Pilate didn't like them, and here he can't get past his own prejudice to take a real look at the facts and then stand on those facts. If you read through Romans 18, those verses there, I'm not going to read them, but the paraphrase that I think Pilate is saying is, of course this isn't my own thinking when Jesus says, is this your idea? He's basically saying, no, I'm not a Jew. I'd never think of you as a king. See, it's a continuation of his desire to say, it's a Jewish issue. It's not my problem. But I want to read the scenario of the last two questions. It says this in verse 35. What is it you have done? Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place. You are a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. What is truth? Retorted Pilate. Those verses, Jesus lays out the whole reason that he's here, to testify to the truth. And Pilate responds with cynicism and skepticism, and he basically belittles Jesus, and he makes fun of the whole statement when he says, I am here to testify to the truth. Pilate says, so what's truth? He was a cynic. He was a skeptic. Maybe in the back of his mind, he was hearing his wife's dream that she told him, don't have anything to do with Jesus, Matthew 27 says. I don't know, there are probably a lot of different reasons that Pilate didn't want to deal with Jesus, but all of them came down to this one thing. He appeased the people. He appeased the people. He appeased the people so that he didn't have to deal with the real issues, his own issues. And in Pilate's humanity, we see ourselves. We see what happens so many times when we feel pressure from the people around us. Sometimes we get to the point where we feel that pressure when we're appeasing and say, it's not worth the price, it's not worth the headache, it's not worth the hassle, and we just give in. You see, in this whole chapter, John tells us that Jesus was true to the very end, and because Jesus is true to who he is a trustworthy king. He was arrested by the soldiers. What did he do? He shows care to the enemy. Annas was looking out for himself, for his own comfort and power. And Jesus uses what was a negative, an unrighteous situation, an unrighteous man, and uses it to make God's plan, to make righteousness available for us, to make salvation available for all of us. Peter had courage, but uncertainty brought doubt. Unknown brings fear. And Pilate in his weakness just appeases the people when the pressure goes up. I'm pretty sure that somewhere in these people we see ourselves from time to time. But the truth is this, that Jesus keeps loving us. Jesus keeps reaching out to us. Jesus never changes. He can be trusted. That's why we can trust him even when we mess up, even when we do things wrong, even when we run, he still is there to heal us and bring us back into relationship. When we let fear or doubt take over, when we fall to pressure, Jesus lifts us up. We can trust him. And so we're just going to finish with a few questions again to have you think and contemplate about these words. Is your relationship with God one of questioning him, saying things like, why are you doing this? Or is it a trust relationship? Jesus, I don't know what's really going on, but I know I can trust you, who loves even me, your enemy. then do you see and treat Jesus like a counselor or a king? A counselor, you get to decide, do I accept the advice and let it change my life, or do I decide not to follow it? With a king, there's that trust relationship. This is someone you look up to, someone you want to follow. That's who Jesus is. It's about that trust relationship. And then again, to encourage you to share around your table that God is alive and active in our lives. I'm asking you to share a time when you trusted God and how it helped build your relationship with Him. Because these scriptures, Jesus' word, is not just for back then, it's for today. He is active in our lives. And we need to see that and share that in our world. Just one thing, last week we said we're going to go into prayer time and we're going to sing a couple of songs. If you've got a prayer item or a praise item you want to share with us, you can send that to worship at Richmond Baptist. And we're going to try and get those up and be able to pray for them right now. If we don't, it's just because we haven't gotten them yet. We're a little bit delayed from what you see. But let's just pray. God, you are so good. You are trustworthy, even when we have doubt and fear, when we have struggles. You're there. God, may we turn to you. May your presence be active and real in our lives. And in that presence, give us the courage. Courage to have hope in you, who loves us no matter what. In Jesus' name, amen.